In the realm where silence reigns eternal and the aurora dances with ancient spirits, there exists a world carved from ice and time itself. This is the Arctic, not merely a place of endless white, but a cathedral of memory where every snowflake carries the whispered stories of millennia. Here, beneath the crystalline dome of perpetual winter, lie the footprints of the first brave souls who dared to call this frozen paradise home. The wind speaks in tongues unknown to southern lands, carrying secrets of survival, wisdom, and wonder that have shaped the very essence of human resilience. Tonight, as you drift into peaceful slumber, let us journey together to this mystical realm where the boundary between earth and heaven dissolves into shimmering ice, and where the hidden history of the Arctic unfolds like a dream. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. In the beginning, before human memory began its long dance with the polar winds, there was only the slow, inexorable breath of ice. The Arctic was not always the realm of endless winter we know today. Millions of years ago, when the earth was young and restless, vast tropical seas lapped against shores where now only permafrost reigns. Ancient ferns swayed in warm breezes, where today the northern lights paint their ethereal canvas across the star-drunk sky. The ice came gradually, as all profound changes do in the Arctic. It crept southward from the pole like a gentle, persistent dream, reshaping mountains, carving valleys, and creating the magnificent desolation that would one day cradle the most resilient cultures humanity has ever known. Each advancing glacier was a storyteller, etching tales into the very bedrock, leaving behind a landscape of such stark beauty that it would inspire both terror and wonder in all who beheld it. As the ice sheets grew, they created their own weather patterns, their own rhythms of light and darkness. The Arctic Ocean, once a temperate sea teeming with marine life, gradually transformed into a frozen mirror reflecting the cosmos. During the long polar nights, when the sun disappeared for months at a time, the ice sang with the voices of expansion and contraction, creating symphonies that only the wind could carry. In this primordial landscape, life persisted with a tenacity that defied comprehension. Arctic foxes developed their pristine white coats, becoming living ghosts that moved like whispered prayers across the tundra. Seals learned to maintain breathing holes in ice that could crush ships, their intelligence evolving alongside their environment. The mighty polar bears emerged as the apex predators of this white world, perfectly adapted to hunt on the shifting ice floes that became their floating kingdoms. The caribou, those eternal wanderers of the north, established migration routes that spanned thousands of miles, following invisible paths carved by instinct and necessity. Their hoofbeats created the first highways across the tundra, routes that would later guide human travelers through the seemingly trackless wilderness. These great herds moved like living rivers across the landscape, their antlers creating forests that walked, their breath forming clouds that spoke of endurance beyond human comprehension. During the long summer days, when the sun never set and the ice took on hues of blue and purple that had no names in any human language, the Arctic revealed its hidden abundance. Flowers bloomed in explosions of color that lasted mere weeks but burned themselves into the memory of the land. Arctic poppies turned their faces to follow the midnight sun, while tiny willows, ancient beyond their diminutive size, created carpets of life across the permafrost. The sea ice became a bridge between worlds, connecting continents and creating pathways for both animals and, eventually, the first human explorers. Each winter, the ice extended its reach, creating temporary land masses larger than many countries. Each spring, it retreated, leaving behind a transformed landscape and new opportunities for life to flourish in the brief growing season. In the depths of winter, when temperatures plunged to levels that could freeze breath in midair, the aurora borealis began its eternal dance. These lights, born from the collision of solar particles with the Earth's magnetic field, became the Arctic's first storytellers. They painted narratives across the sky in colors that shifted from green to purple to pink, creating a celestial theater that would inspire human imagination for millennia to come. The Arctic's rivers, flowing northward unlike their southern cousins, carved their own unique character into the landscape. The Mackenzie, the Obi, the Yenisei, and the Lena became arteries of life, carrying nutrients from the continental heartlands to the frozen seas. During the brief summer months, these rivers would flood their banks, creating vast wetlands that served as nurseries for millions of migratory birds. It was into this world of ice and extremes that the first human beings would eventually venture, driven by curiosity, necessity, and an indomitable spirit that matched the harsh beauty of their chosen homeland. But that story begins not with the land itself, but with the gradual understanding that life could not only survive in such conditions, but could thrive with a richness and complexity that would teach the rest of humanity profound lessons about adaptation, community, and the art of living in harmony with forces beyond human control. The permafrost beneath the surface ice held its own secrets, preserving in its frozen embrace the remains of creatures that had lived and died tens of thousands of years ago. Mammoth tusks and woolly rhinoceros bones waited in their icy tombs, creating a natural museum that would one day help scientists understand the true age and complexity of Arctic history. This frozen archive spoke of times when the Arctic was different, yet somehow eternal, always finding new ways to sustain life in conditions that tested the very limits of existence. The first human footsteps in the Arctic were not those of explorers or conquerors, but of families seeking survival and finding, against all odds, a way to transform the world's most challenging environment into home. These earliest Arctic peoples, the ancestors of the Inuit, emerged from the mists of prehistory, carrying with them innovations so elegant and practical that modern technology still struggles to improve upon their designs. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans first ventured into the Arctic regions around 40,000 years ago, following the great herds of mammoth and bison across the Bering Land Bridge. These early pioneers possessed a knowledge of survival that bordered on the mystical, understanding instinctively how to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in a world where winter could last 9 months and summer was but a brief, precious interlude. The Dorset people, known to archaeologists as the Paleo-Eskimos, were among the first to truly master Arctic survival. They appeared in the archaeological record around 2,500 years ago, leaving behind evidence of a sophisticated culture that had learned to thrive in conditions that would defeat most modern humans within hours. Their tools, carved from bone, antler, and stone, displayed an understanding of physics and engineering that allowed them to hunt seals through breathing holes in ice several feet thick. These early Arctic dwellers developed the kayak, perhaps one of humanity's most perfect watercraft designs, constructed from sealskin stretched over a framework of bone and wood. The kayak was both incredibly light and absolutely watertight. A skilled hunter could roll his kayak completely over in the frigid Arctic waters and emerge dry and unharmed. A technique that required years of practice and an intimate understanding of water dynamics that few cultures have ever achieved. The umiak, the larger women's boat, served as the family vessel for longer journeys and heavier cargo. These boats could carry entire families with their possessions across treacherous Arctic waters, navigating by stars, wind patterns, and the subtle signs of ice formation that only generations of accumulated wisdom could interpret. The construction of an umiak was a community effort, with multiple families contributing materials and labor, creating vessels that were not just transportation, but symbols of collective survival. Winter habitation required innovations that challenged every assumption about architecture and insulation. The snow house, or igloo, represented an understanding of thermodynamics that was both practical and profound. By cutting blocks of wind-packed snow in a precise spiral pattern, Arctic builders could create domed structures that were not only warm enough for comfortable habitation, but actually became stronger as the temperature dropped. The interior heat would cause a thin layer of the inner surface to melt slightly and then refreeze, creating a shell of ice that made the structure nearly indestructible. The oil lamp, carved from soapstone and fueled by seal oil, provided both heat and light during the long polar nights. These lamps, tended primarily by women, required incredible skill to maintain properly. The flame had to be kept at exactly the right height and intensity to provide maximum warmth without producing dangerous carbon monoxide. The knowledge of lamp tending was passed from mother to daughter through generations, each family developing their own subtle techniques and preferences. Clothing in the Arctic was not mere protection from the elements, but a sophisticated life support system that had to function perfectly in conditions ranging from plus 10 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The traditional parka, or anorak, used principles of layered insulation that modern outdoor gear still emulates. The inner layer was made from soft caribou skin worn with the fur against the body, while the outer layer used skins with the fur facing outward to shed wind and moisture. Mittens were often constructed with an inner and outer shell, allowing for fine manipulation when necessary while maintaining warmth. The Arctic peoples developed an understanding of animal behavior that allowed them to predict the movements of seals, walruses, whales, and caribou with extraordinary accuracy. They knew that ringed seals would maintain breathing holes in specific ice conditions, that bearded seals preferred certain depths, and that walruses would gather in predictable locations during their migrations. This knowledge was not written down but carried in memory, passed through stories and practical instruction that embedded survival skills so deeply they became instinctive. The sled dog, one of humanity's earliest and most successful partnerships with another species, was developed to perfection in the Arctic. These dogs were not pets, but essential partners in survival, capable of finding their way home across featureless ice in complete darkness, detecting dangerous thin ice through smell and sound, and providing warmth to their human companions during emergency shelter situations. The relationship between musher and lead dog was often described as telepathic, based on subtle communications that had been refined over thousands of years of partnership. Navigation in the Arctic required skills that bordered on the supernatural, with no visible landmarks for hundreds of miles and weather that could change from clear to whiteout conditions in minutes. Arctic travelers developed methods of wayfinding that used wind patterns, snow formation, star positions, and even the behavior of their dogs to maintain direction. They could read the landscape through their feet, feeling the subtle differences in snow texture that indicated underlying terrain features, invisible to the eye. The success of these early Arctic peoples was not just individual but communal. They developed social structures that emphasized sharing, cooperation, and mutual support because they understood intuitively that in the Arctic, the survival of each individual depended absolutely on the survival of the group. Food sharing was not charity but practical necessity. Today's lucky hunter might be tomorrow's beneficiary of another's success. These first Arctic dwellers also developed a complex spiritual relationship with their environment that recognized the intelligence and agency of the animals they hunted, the ice they traveled upon, and the weather they endured. They understood that survival in the Arctic required not just physical skill, but a proper relationship with forces beyond human control. And they developed ceremonies and practices that honored these relationships and maintained the spiritual balance necessary for continued survival in such an extreme environment. Within the crystalline silence of the Arctic, where the aurora painted stories across the star-filled dome of night, the indigenous peoples developed a wisdom so profound that it would take modern science centuries to appreciate its depth and sophistication. These were not primitive people struggling against nature, but sophisticated societies that had learned to read the Arctic's most subtle languages and to live in partnership with forces that could destroy the unprepared in moments. The Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, emerged around 1,000 years ago as perhaps the most successful Arctic culture in human history. They spread across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland in less than 2 centuries. An expansion that represented not conquest but adaptation, so perfect that they could thrive in environments where previous peoples had merely survived. Their success lay not in domination of their environment, but in understanding it so completely that they became part of its natural rhythms. The Thule developed a technology of such elegance that many of their innovations have never been improved upon. Their harpoons, designed for hunting seals and whales, incorporated a toggle head that would turn sideways once embedded in the prey, creating a secure attachment that could withstand the tremendous forces generated by a wounded whale. The line that connected harpoon to hunter was often made from split walrus hide, braided in patterns that provided exactly the right combination of strength and elasticity. These Arctic peoples developed a sophisticated understanding of ice that allowed them to travel safely across frozen seas that claimed the lives of later European explorers, despite their advanced equipment. They could determine ice thickness by its color and sound, identify dangerous pressure ridges from miles away, and predict ice movement based on wind, current, and temperature patterns. This knowledge was encoded in a vocabulary that had dozens of words for different types of ice, each describing specific conditions that carried implications for travel, hunting, and safety. The construction of winter dwellings represented an understanding of physics that was both practical and elegant. Semi-subterranean houses, partially dug into the permafrost and covered with sod and stone, created living spaces that remained comfortable even when outside temperatures plunged to deadly levels. These houses featured ingenious ventilation systems that provided fresh air while conserving heat, and storage areas that took advantage of natural refrigeration to preserve food through the long winters. Arctic peoples developed a form of astronomy that was uniquely adapted to their environment and needs. During the long polar nights, when the sun disappeared for months, they used the position of stars, the phases of the moon, and the behavior of the aurora to track time and navigate across vast distances. Their star knowledge was encoded in stories, that served simultaneously as entertainment, education, and practical navigation tools, ensuring that essential information was preserved and transmitted across generations. The art of storytelling in Arctic cultures served functions far beyond entertainment. Stories carried practical information about weather patterns, animal behavior, geographical features, and survival techniques, embedded in narratives that were engaging enough to ensure they would be remembered and retold accurately. The story of Sedna, the sea goddess, taught listeners about the importance of respecting marine animals and maintaining proper relationships with the spirit world that was believed to control hunting success. Arctic peoples developed a complex understanding of nutrition that allowed them to maintain perfect health on a diet that seemed impossible to outsiders. They understood which parts of animals contained essential vitamins, how to prepare foods to maximize nutritional value, and how to preserve nutrients during long storage periods. The practice of eating raw meat and fish was not primitive behavior, but sophisticated nutrition science that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases that plagued European explorers. The social structures developed by Arctic peoples were perfectly adapted to their environment's demands. Leadership was often situational, with different individuals taking charge based on their specific expertise and the particular challenges at hand. The best hunter might lead during a hunting expedition, while the most skilled navigator took command during travel, and the most experienced elder guided the group during times of hardship or decision-making. Women in Arctic societies held positions of enormous respect and responsibility, their knowledge of clothing, construction, food preparation, and lamp maintenance being literally matters of life and death for their families. The ability to sew waterproof seams, maintain proper oil lamp flames, and prepare food that would sustain hunters during long expeditions required skills that took years to master and were considered as valuable as any hunting ability. Arctic peoples developed forms of art that served both aesthetic and practical purposes. The intricate geometric patterns carved into ivory hunting tools were not merely decorative, but served as grip enhancements and identification marks. Throat singing, practiced particularly by Inuit women, was both entertainment and a form of vocal exercise that maintained the flexibility needed for the precise articulation required in their language's complex sound system. The drum dance ceremonies that punctuated Arctic social life served multiple functions within the community. They provided entertainment during the long dark winters, resolved social conflicts through ritualized competition, and maintained the oral traditions that preserved essential cultural knowledge. The drums themselves, made from caribou hide stretched over wooden frames, produced sounds that were believed to carry messages to the spirit world and attract the attention of the animals that provided sustenance. Arctic cultures developed sophisticated methods of conflict resolution that emphasized restoration of harmony rather than punishment. Public song contests allowed individuals to air grievances through improvised lyrics that could be biting in their criticism, while remaining within acceptable social bounds. These contests served as both entertainment and justice system, allowing communities to address problems while maintaining the cooperation essential for survival. The relationship between Arctic peoples and their environment was characterized by a profound understanding of sustainability that ensured resource availability for future generations. They developed hunting practices that took only what was needed, used every part of the animals they killed, and maintained spiritual practices that emphasized gratitude and respect for the creatures that gave their lives to sustain human life. This was not sentimentality, but practical wisdom that recognized the interconnectedness of all life in the Arctic ecosystem. The seasonal round of activities developed by Arctic peoples represented a sophisticated understanding of resource availability and optimal timing for different activities. Spring brought seal hunting on the ice. Summer meant fishing and gathering. Fall was the time for caribou hunting and preparation for winter. And winter itself was the season for indoor activities like tool making, storytelling, and the maintenance of social relationships that would ensure community cohesion through the challenging months ahead. In the vast cathedral of Arctic silence, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind across snow and the distant crack of shifting ice, the indigenous peoples developed a spiritual understanding of their world that was as complex and sophisticated as any philosophical system ever conceived. This was not a primitive animism, but a nuanced worldview that recognized intelligence, personality, and agency in every aspect of the Arctic environment. From the smallest snowflake to the massive ice floes that served as highways across the frozen sea, the concept of Inwa, the spirit or soul that inhabited all things, provided the foundation for Arctic spirituality. Every animal possessed an Inwa that was intelligent, conscious, and capable of making decisions about whether to allow itself to be hunted. The success of a hunt depended not just on the hunter's skill, but on their ability to maintain proper relationships with the Inwa of the animals they sought. This required a combination of technical expertise, spiritual preparation, and ethical behavior that extended far beyond the hunt itself. The figure of the Angakkuq, or shaman, served as the intermediary between the human community and the spiritual forces that governed Arctic life. These were not mystical figures removed from daily life, but practical spiritual advisors who combined healing knowledge, weather prediction, psychological counseling, and ritual leadership into a single role. The Angakkuq's training often took decades, involving not just the memorization of songs and ceremonies, but the development of abilities to enter altered states of consciousness and communicate with spiritual forces. The underwater realm of Sedna, the sea goddess, represented one of the Arctic's most sophisticated spiritual concepts. Sedna was believed to control all marine mammals, releasing them to hunters who maintained proper spiritual relationships while withholding them from those who violated taboos or failed to show appropriate respect. The story of Sedna served simultaneously as entertainment, moral instruction, and practical guidance for maintaining the spiritual balance necessary for successful hunting. Arctic spiritual practices included elaborate taboo systems that governed behavior toward animals, tools, and natural phenomena. These taboos, which might seem arbitrary to outsiders, actually represented sophisticated environmental management systems that prevented overhunting, maintained respect for natural cycles, and ensured that essential resources remained available for future generations. The taboo against hunting certain animals during their breeding seasons, for example, protected population sustainability while being explained in spiritual terms that made the restrictions meaningful and memorable. The practice of names created spiritual continuity between generations, with deceased individuals being reborn through children who received their names. This was not simple reincarnation, but a complex system that maintained cultural memory and ensured that essential knowledge and personality traits were preserved within the community. A child who received the name of a famous hunter was expected to develop similar skills and was given special training and encouragement to fulfill this spiritual inheritance. Arctic dreams were understood as journeys into spiritual realms where important information could be obtained about weather, animal movements, and potential dangers. Dream interpretation was a sophisticated practice that combined personal symbolism with cultural knowledge to provide practical guidance for daily life. Hunters often made important decisions based on dreams, and the ability to receive and interpret significant dreams was considered a valuable spiritual gift. The aurora borealis held special significance in Arctic spirituality, often interpreted as the spirits of the dead playing games in the sky or as pathways that souls followed to reach the afterlife. The lights were believed to respond to human activities, brightening in response to music and dancing, and dimming when people spoke too loudly or behaved inappropriately. This created a sense of cosmic participation where human behavior had direct effects on the natural world. Ritual purification practices prepared hunters for expeditions and helped maintain the spiritual cleanliness necessary for successful interaction with animal spirits. These rituals often involved specific bathing practices, dietary restrictions, and behavioral modifications that served both spiritual and practical purposes. The requirement for hunters to remain sexually abstinent before important hunts, for example, helped ensure they were focused and undistracted during dangerous activities. The spiritual significance of first animals hunted created elaborate ceremonies that honored the creature's sacrifice and ensured its spirit would return to provide future hunting opportunities. The first seal killed by a young hunter might be celebrated with community feasts and ritual observances that could last for days, emphasizing the significance of the event and the responsibilities that came with the ability to take life to sustain life. Arctic funeral practices reflected sophisticated beliefs about the journey of the soul after death and the continued relationship between the living and the dead. Bodies were often placed on platforms or in special burial structures that allowed the spirit to depart freely while protecting the physical remains from scavengers. Personal possessions were included with the deceased to assist them in their spiritual journey, and specific songs and ceremonies helped guide the departing soul to its proper destination. The spiritual relationship with ice was particularly complex, as ice was understood to be alive and responsive to human behavior. Travelers performed ceremonies before venturing onto sea ice, asking permission from the ice spirits and promising to behave respectfully during their journey. The ice was believed to have memory and could recognize individuals who had treated it badly in the past, potentially creating dangerous conditions for those who had violated proper protocols. Seasonal spiritual observances marked the changing relationship between humans and their environment throughout the year. The return of the sun after the long polar night was celebrated with ceremonies that welcomed back warmth and light while acknowledging the spiritual forces that controlled these cosmic rhythms. These celebrations served both religious and psychological purposes, helping communities maintain morale during the most challenging periods of the Arctic year. The practice of spiritual adoption allowed communities to maintain proper relationships with animal populations by formally adopting the spirits of hunted animals into their kinship systems. This created obligations on both sides. Humans were required to treat the adopted animal spirits as family members, while the animal spirits were expected to provide protection and assistance to their human relatives. This system created a complex web of spiritual relationships that governed hunting practices and resource management. Arctic spiritual medicine combined practical healing knowledge with sophisticated understanding of the connections between physical health, emotional well-being, and spiritual balance. Healing ceremonies often involved not just the patient but their entire family and social network, recognizing that individual illness might reflect problems in social relationships or violations of spiritual protocols that required community-wide solutions. The healing process frequently included confession of wrongdoing, restoration of damaged relationships, and recommitment to proper spiritual practices. As we drift deeper into the spiritual landscape of the Arctic, we begin to understand that this was not a harsh wilderness where humans struggled against hostile forces, but a living, conscious world where survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with intelligent beings who could choose to help or hinder human endeavors. This sophisticated spiritual system provided not just meaning and comfort, but practical guidance for living successfully in one of Earth's most challenging environments, creating communities that thrived for thousands of years in conditions that continue to test the limits of human adaptation and ingenuity across the Bering Land Bridge, their footsteps leaving the first human marks upon a world of eternal winter. These were not mere wanderers, but survivors of extraordinary resilience, carrying within their hearts the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had learned to read the language of ice and wind. The Thule people emerged from this ancient migration like spirits materializing from the aurora itself. They possessed an almost mystical understanding of their frozen domain, developing technologies so perfectly adapted to Arctic life that they would remain virtually unchanged for over 1,000 years. Their kayaks, carved from single pieces of driftwood and stretched with seal hide, moved through icy waters with the silent grace of hunting seals. These vessels were not merely boats, but extensions of the hunter's very soul, responding to the slightest shift in weight or in tension with fluid precision. In the long polar nights, when darkness stretched for months like a velvet blanket studded with diamond stars, the Thule gathered in their ice houses. These structures, built with architectural genius born of necessity, used the very cold that threatened to destroy them as their greatest ally. Blocks of ice, cut with bone tools and fitted with mathematical precision, created domes that trapped body heat while remaining impervious to the howling winds outside. Within these crystalline sanctuaries, generations passed down stories that contained the compressed wisdom of survival in the world's most hostile environment. The shamans among them served as living libraries, their memories holding not just myths and legends, but precise knowledge of weather patterns, animal migrations, and the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the Arctic wilderness. They spoke of Sedna, the sea goddess whose flowing hair became tangled with the sins of humanity, causing storms and famine until a brave shaman could dive to the ocean's depths to comb her locks smooth again. These were not mere superstitions, but sophisticated systems of environmental observation wrapped in the poetry of the human spirit. Their understanding of ice was particularly profound. They possessed dozens of words for different types of snow and ice, each describing subtle variations that could determine the success of a hunt or the safety of a journey. Young ice that sang when walked upon, old ice that groaned with the weight of centuries, pressure ridges that could crush a kayak or provide shelter from storms. All of this was encoded in their language and passed down through generations. With the solemnity of sacred knowledge, the Dorset culture, which preceded the Thule, had developed an even more mysterious relationship with their Arctic world. Archaeological evidence suggests they possessed artistic sensibilities of remarkable sophistication, carving tiny figurines from walrus ivory with such delicate precision that modern archaeologists marvel at their skill. These miniature sculptures, often no larger than a thumb, depicted polar bears, seals, and human figures with an intimate understanding of form that spoke of profound spiritual connection to the Arctic ecosystem. Unlike their Thule successors, the Dorset people appeared to have lived in harmony with the Arctic without developing complex hunting technologies. They hunted seals at breathing holes with nothing more than bone-tipped spears, waiting motionless for hours in temperatures that would kill most humans within minutes. Their patience was legendary, transforming the act of hunting into a form of meditation where the boundary between hunter and hunted dissolved into something approaching spiritual communion. The Dorset people vanished mysteriously around 1000 CE, leaving behind only their exquisite carvings and the stone foundations of their dwellings. Some scholars believe they were absorbed by the expanding Thule culture, while others suggest they simply chose to fade away like morning mist when their time in the Arctic had reached its natural conclusion. The Thule who came after spoke of them in whispers, calling them the Tionet, a race of giants who could lift massive stones and possessed magical powers, but were too gentle to survive in a changing world. While indigenous peoples had called the Arctic home for thousands of years, the first recorded European encounter with these frozen realms came through the Norse. Those fearless seafarers who treated the North Atlantic as their personal highway to adventure and conquest. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for a killing that had stained his reputation as surely as blood stains snow, turned his ship's prow toward the unknown western waters in 982 CE, seeking redemption through discovery. The Greenland that Eric discovered was a land of magnificent desolation, where ice sheets 2 miles thick pressed down upon the bedrock with the weight of geological time itself. Yet even here, in valleys sheltered from the worst Arctic winds, he found patches of grassland that seemed to glow with emerald promise during the brief summer months. With the promotional instincts of a medieval real estate developer, he named his forbidding land Greenland, hoping the appealing name would attract settlers to his new domain. The Norse colonies that Eric established represented one of humanity's most audacious attempts to transplant European civilization into the Arctic environment. For nearly 500 years, these hardy settlers clung to the edges of the ice sheet, raising cattle and sheep in meadows that bloomed for mere weeks each year, building stone churches where they worshipped the same god they had served in Norway and Iceland, and maintaining trade connections with the outside world that stretched across thousands of miles of treacherous ocean. Their saga speaks of Leif Erikson, Eric's son, who pushed even further westward and became the first European to set foot on North American soil 500 years before Columbus would claim that honor for Spain. The Norse called this new land Vinland, and established temporary settlements where they encountered the indigenous peoples they called Skrælings. These first meetings between Europeans and Native Americans were marked by mutual curiosity that quickly turned to suspicion and eventually to violence, setting a pattern that would echo tragically through the centuries to come. The Greenland Norse developed a unique culture that blended Scandinavian traditions with adaptations forced upon them by Arctic conditions. They learned to hunt seals from their indigenous neighbors, supplementing their traditional diet of livestock and dairy products with the protein-rich meat that could sustain them through the long polar winters. Their churches, built from local stone and driftwood, stood as testament to their determination to maintain their Christian faith even at the edge of the known world. Archaeological excavations of Norse Greenland sites reveal a society that maintained remarkably sophisticated connections to medieval Europe despite their isolation. Fragments of stained glass windows from France, pieces of chainmail that suggest ongoing military traditions, and carved walrus ivory that was traded as far south as Rome all testify to a people who refused to be forgotten by the wider world. Despite living in one of its most remote corners, yet climate change would prove to be their ultimate adversary. The medieval warm period that had made their original settlement possible began to end in the 13th century, ushering in what historians call the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter and colder. The growing season contracted, and the sea ice that had remained at a respectful distance began to creep closer to their settlements. Ships from Iceland and Norway found it increasingly difficult to navigate the ice-choked waters, cutting the colonies off from the supplies and reinforcements they needed to survive. The last written record from Norse Greenland dates to 1408, a wedding certificate that speaks poignantly of hope and normal life continuing even as their world slowly froze around them. By the time European explorers returned to Greenland in the 16th century, they found only empty stone buildings and grave markers covered by advancing ice. The Norse settlers had vanished as completely as if the Arctic itself had swallowed them, leaving behind only the whispered memory of their remarkable attempt to make a home in the world's most unforgiving landscape. The 16th century brought a new wave of European interest in the Arctic, driven not by the desire for settlement, but by the golden dream of finding a shorter route to the riches of Asia. The Northwest Passage, that mythical waterway that would theoretically allow ships to sail over the top of North America to reach the Pacific, became the holy grail of Arctic exploration, inspiring generations of brave men to sail into the icebound unknown in search of fame, fortune, and national glory. Martin Frobisher, that doughty English sea captain with the practical soul of a merchant and the dreams of a conquistador, led 3 expeditions into the Canadian Arctic between 1576 and 1578. His ships, built for the relatively gentle waters of the English Channel, groaned and creaked as they pushed through ice floes that could crush oak planks like eggshells. Frobisher's men, dressed in wool and leather that provided little protection against Arctic cold, huddled around braziers on deck while their breath froze in the air and their drinking water turned to solid ice. On his first voyage, Frobisher discovered what he believed to be gold on Baffin Island, setting off a miniature gold rush that would prove to be based on nothing more valuable than iron pyrite, fool's gold that glittered with false promise in the Arctic sun. His subsequent expeditions, loaded down with miners and smelting equipment, demonstrated the profound gap between European expectations and Arctic realities. The miners, accustomed to working underground in the relatively warm temperatures of English coal mines, found themselves trying to extract ore from ground that was frozen solid even in midsummer. Henry Hudson, whose name would eventually grace one of North America's greatest bays, brought a different approach to Arctic exploration. A navigator of exceptional skill and determination, Hudson understood that success in the Arctic required not just courage but also the patience to wait for the right conditions and the wisdom to recognize when retreat was necessary. His 1610 expedition into what is now Hudson Bay represented the most systematic attempt yet made to find the Northwest. Passage through careful exploration rather than reckless pressing forward. Hudson's crew, however, lacked their captain's patience and vision. As winter closed in and their ship became trapped in the ice, they began to grumble about the wisdom of their mission. The Arctic winter tested their resolve with temperatures that turned their breath to ice crystals and froze their drinking water solid within minutes of being poured. Food supplies dwindled as hunting proved nearly impossible in the barren landscape, and scurvy began to weaken the crew as their bodies were deprived of the vitamins necessary for survival. in June 1611, when the ice finally began to break up. Hudson's crew staged a mutiny that would become one of the most infamous acts of betrayal in the history of Arctic exploration. They set Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 loyal crew members adrift in a small boat in the frigid waters of Hudson Bay, leaving them to face almost certain death in the vast wilderness. Hudson was never seen again, but his sacrifice was not entirely in vain. His careful observations and maps would guide future explorers, and Hudson Bay itself became a crucial gateway for the fur trade that would shape North American history. William Baffin, sailing in search of the Northwest Passage in 1616, pushed further north than any European before him, reaching 77 degrees north latitude in what would later be called Baffin Bay. His observations of Arctic conditions were remarkably sophisticated for the time, noting the relationship between ice formation and water salinity, documenting the behavior of Arctic wildlife, and making careful measurements of magnetic variation that would prove invaluable to future navigators. Baffin's expedition demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of early 17th century Arctic exploration. His ship, the Discovery, was essentially a modified merchant vessel with no special adaptations for ice navigation, yet through skillful seamanship and careful observation of ice conditions, Baffin was able to navigate safely through waters that had defeated many previous expeditions. His success illustrated that Arctic exploration required not just advanced technology, but also a deep understanding of the unique challenges posed by the polar environment. The Dutch, not to be outdone by their English rivals, sent Willem Barents on 3 expeditions to find a northeast passage over the top of Russia. Barents possessed perhaps the most scientific mind among the early Arctic explorers, making careful observations of Arctic phenomena that would not be fully understood until centuries later. He documented the behavior of polar bears with the precision of a natural historian, noting their hunting strategies, social behavior, and remarkable adaptation to their frozen environment. Barents' 3rd expedition, in 1596, ended in disaster, when his ship became trapped in the ice near Novaya Zemlya, forced to overwinter in a shelter built from driftwood and ship's timbers. Barents and his crew endured an Arctic winter that tested the very limits of human endurance. They recorded temperatures so cold that their wine froze solid, their breath formed ice stalactites inside their shelter, and they had to keep a constant fire burning just to prevent themselves from freezing to death in their sleep. Despite these horrific conditions, Barents maintained his scientific observations throughout the winter, documenting the aurora borealis with the wonder of a man seeing angels dance across the polar sky. His descriptions of the northern lights remain among the most poetic and accurate early accounts of this phenomenon, capturing both the visual spectacle and the emotional impact of watching the heavens come alive with curtains of green and gold. Barents died during the expedition, but his crew managed to survive the winter and make their way back to civilization in small boats, carrying with them not only the story of their ordeal but also Barents' careful scientific observations. Their survival proved that Europeans could endure an Arctic winter with proper preparation and determination, setting the stage for more ambitious expeditions in the centuries to come. As the 17th century progressed, European interest in the Arctic began to shift from the elusive dream of passage routes to the very real profits that could be extracted from the region's abundant wildlife. The fur trade, which would dominate Arctic economics for nearly 3 centuries, transformed the relationship between European civilization and the polar world from one of exploration to one of systematic exploitation and cultural exchange. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered by King Charles II in 1670, represented perhaps the most successful attempt by any European power to establish a permanent presence in the Arctic. Unlike the temporary expeditions that had characterized earlier Arctic ventures, the company came to stay, building permanent trading posts at the mouths of rivers that drained into Hudson Bay and establishing supply lines that would endure for centuries. These trading posts became the first successful European settlements in the North American Arctic. Small outposts of civilization that served as meeting points between two very different worlds. Company factors, often men of remarkable character and determination, learned to speak indigenous languages, understand local customs, and navigate the complex social relationships that governed trade in the Arctic wilderness. They were part merchant, part diplomat, and part anthropologist, bridging cultures that had evolved in complete isolation from each other. The indigenous peoples who traded with the Hudson's Bay Company found themselves at the center of a transformation that would reshape their traditional way of life in fundamental ways. European manufactured goods, steel knives, woolen blankets, firearms, and metal tools offered undeniable advantages over traditional materials, but they also created dependencies that would prove difficult to break. A hunter who had grown accustomed to the reliability of a steel knife might find himself helpless if cut off from the trading post that supplied such marvels. The beaver, that industrious rodent whose dense fur had adapted perfectly to the cold waters of northern rivers, became the unofficial currency of the North American Arctic. Beaver pelts, prized in Europe for their ability to be transformed into waterproof felt for hats, were worth their weight in manufactured goods. Entire indigenous communities reorganized their seasonal migrations around beaver territories, and the sound of steel traps snapping shut in the wilderness marked the rhythm of a new economic order. Yet the fur trade was never simply a matter of economic exchange. It fostered a unique culture of intermarriage and cultural blending that produced the Métis people, whose mixed European and indigenous heritage created new ways of living in the Arctic environment. These children of two worlds often served as interpreters, guides, and traders themselves, moving fluently between indigenous camps and European trading posts with a cultural flexibility that proved invaluable in the complex social landscape of the fur trade. The voyageurs, those legendary French-Canadian canoeists who transported trade goods and furs along the waterways of the Arctic, developed their own distinct culture adapted to the demands of wilderness travel. Loading their birch-bark canoes with up to 4,000 pounds of cargo, they could paddle from dawn to dusk through waters that ranged from Miracom Lake surfaces to wild rapids that could dash an unwary paddler against the rocks. Their songs, echoing across silent lakes in the pre-dawn darkness, became the soundtrack of Arctic commerce. These men lived by a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the migrations of fur-bearing animals. Spring brought the breakup of ice and the opening of water routes. Summer meant long days of paddling through mosquito-infested wilderness. Autumn was the season of intensive trapping as animals grew their winter coats. And winter meant survival in isolated camps where the margin between life and death could be measured in degrees of temperature and pounds of stored food. The competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and its rival, the Northwest Company, drove both organizations to push deeper into unexplored Arctic territories in search of new sources of furs and new routes to transport them. This commercial rivalry inadvertently became one of the great driving forces of Arctic exploration, as traders and their indigenous guides mapped vast territories and established the first accurate understanding of Arctic geography. Alexander Mackenzie, working for the Northwest Company, followed the river that now bears his name all the way to the Arctic Ocean in 1789, becoming the first European to cross the North American continent north of Mexico. His journey, undertaken primarily for commercial rather than scientific purposes, nevertheless added immeasurably to European knowledge of Arctic geography and demonstrated that the continent was far larger and more complex than anyone had previously imagined. The fur trade era also witnessed the first systematic attempts to understand Arctic weather patterns and their impact on human activity. Company officials, whose livelihoods depended on predicting when rivers would freeze and when they would, developed sophisticated systems for observing and recording weather conditions. Their records, maintained with the meticulous care of men whose survival depended on accuracy, provide modern climatologists with some of the earliest reliable data about Arctic climate patterns. As the 18th century drew to a close, the fur trade had established a network of relationships and dependencies that stretched from the boardrooms of London to the most remote corners of the Arctic wilderness. Indigenous communities had been drawn into a global economy. European companies had learned to operate in some of the world's most challenging environments, and a new generation of Arctic-born people had emerged who were equally at home in both worlds. This period of relative stability and mutual accommodation was already showing signs of strain. However, as overhunting began to deplete animal populations and as changing fashions in Europe reduced demand for certain types of furs, the stage was being set for a new phase in Arctic history, one that would be dominated not by commercial exploitation but by scientific curiosity and the renewed dream of finding the Northwest Passage that had eluded explorers for centuries. The legacy of the fur trade era would endure long after the last beaver had been trapped and the last trading post had been abandoned. It had established the first sustained contact between European and indigenous Arctic peoples, created new hybrid cultures that would influence Arctic development for generations, and provided the economic foundation for the first permanent European settlements in the North American Arctic. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that Europeans could not simply impose their will upon the Arctic environment, but must learn to work with it, adapting their methods and expectations to the realities of life in the world's most demanding climate. The rhythms of the fur trade, the seasonal migrations, the patient waiting for the right weather conditions, the careful observation of animal behavior had taught Europeans to think in Arctic time, measured not in hours or days, but in seasons and years. This fundamental shift in perspective would prove essential as the next generation of Arctic explorers prepared to tackle challenges that would make the fur traders' struggles seem like comfortable adventures by comparison. The whispered legends of the Inuit would soon collide with the thunderous ambitions of European empires. As wooden ships began to press against the Arctic's ancient barriers, like moths drawn to a flame that would consume them whole. The 16th century dawned with a fever that spread through the royal courts of Europe like wildfire. Gold, spices, and silk flowed from the east through Ottoman hands, and every European power dreamed of finding their own route to the treasures of Cathay. The Arctic, that mysterious crown of the world, beckoned with promises of a Northwest Passage that would make whoever controlled it master of global trade. Martin Frobisher stood on the deck of the Gabriel in 1576, his eyes fixed on the ice-bound coast of what would later be called Baffin Island. The Yorkshire-born navigator had convinced Queen Elizabeth I and a consortium of London merchants to fund his quest for the passage to China. The Arctic wind cut through his woolen cloak as he gazed upon a landscape that seemed crafted from the very essence of eternity itself. The first encounter between Frobisher's men and the Inuit people unfolded like a tragic opera performed on nature's grandest stage. 5 of his sailors vanished during a trading encounter, swallowed by the vastness as completely as if the ice itself had opened to claim them. In his rage and desperation, Frobisher captured an Inuit hunter, bringing him back to England as proof of his northern discoveries. The man died within weeks, unable to survive in a world so alien to his own. But Frobisher's greatest delusion lay not in his failed diplomacy, but in a glittering black rock he discovered on the shores of the Arctic. Convinced it contained gold, he returned twice more, hauling hundreds of tons of worthless ore back to England. The rock, which sparkled so tantalizingly in the midnight sun, proved to be nothing more than iron pyrite, fool's gold that mocked the dreams of those who sought easy riches in the land of eternal ice. While the English chased mirages of gold and passage, the Dutch emerged as the true masters of Arctic navigation. Willem Barents, a pilot from the small island of Terschelling, possessed an almost supernatural understanding of ice and wind. His 3 voyages to the Arctic between 1594 and 1597 would carve his name into the geography of the far north, though the final journey would demand the ultimate price. The Barents Sea now bears his name, a memorial written in water and ice to a man who pushed further north than any European before him. On his final voyage, his ship became trapped in the ice near Novia Zemlya, forcing him and his crew to endure a winter that tested the very limits of human endurance. The cabin they built from driftwood and ship's timber became their universe for 9 months of darkness. They burned bear fat for light, melted ice for water, and fought off polar bears that stalked them like white shadows in the endless night. Scurvy ravaged their bodies, and the cold was so intense that their breath froze on their beards, creating masks of ice that they had to break away each morning. Barents himself fell ill as spring finally returned to their frozen prison. When the ice began to break up enough to launch their small boats, he was already dying. He passed away on June 20th, 1597, somewhere in the white expanses of the Barents Sea, his last words lost to the wind that had been his constant companion for so many years. The surviving crew members managed to reach safety, but their detailed journals would provide Europeans with their first accurate descriptions of an Arctic winter. Their accounts spoke of phenomena that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The aurora borealis dancing across the sky in curtains of green and gold. The way sound carried impossible distances across the ice, and the profound silence that could drive men to madness. Henry Hudson, that restless soul who would give his name to both a bay and a river, made for voyages between 1607 and 1611, in search of a passage to Asia. His obsession with the Northwest Passage would ultimately lead to one of the Arctic's most enduring mysteries. On his final voyage, his crew mutinied in the vast bay that now bears his name, setting Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 loyal crew members adrift in a small boat. They were never seen again, swallowed by the Arctic as completely as if they had sailed off the edge of the world. The mutineers who returned to England told conflicting stories, but the truth died with Hudson somewhere in the ice-bound waters of Hudson Bay. Some say his ghost still sails those waters, forever searching for the passage that eluded him in life. No tale of Arctic exploration burns brighter or ends more tragically than the story of Sir John Franklin and his doomed expedition. In 1845, the British Admiralty dispatched Franklin with 2 ships, HMS Terror and HMS Erebus, both fitted with the latest technology, including steam engines and reinforced hulls, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of Arctic ice. Franklin was 59 years old, a veteran of Arctic exploration who had already mapped thousands of miles of northern coastline. The Admiralty was so confident in his success that they packed the ships with supplies for 3 years and a library of over 1,000 books. Crystal goblets, silver cutlery, and fine china accompanied the expedition, as if they were sailing to a gentleman's club rather than into the heart of the world's most unforgiving wilderness. The expedition carried 129 souls into the Arctic silence. They were last seen by European eyes in Baffin Bay in July 1845, anchored to an iceberg while they waited for favorable conditions to enter Lancaster Sound. After that, they simply vanished, as if the Arctic had opened its jaws and swallowed them whole. For over a decade, the mystery of Franklin's fate gripped the British imagination. Lady Jane Franklin, his wife, refused to accept his death and funded numerous search expeditions. The Royal Navy launched the largest search operation in its history, sending dozens of ships and hundreds of men to scour the Arctic archipelago for any trace of the missing expedition. The searches revealed more about Arctic geography than any previous exploration, mapping thousands of miles of previously unknown coastland. But of Franklin and his men, they found only tantalizing clues: a few graves on Beechy Island, some scattered equipment, and eventually, through Inuit testimony, hints of a tragedy so complete that it seemed to belong more to literature than to life. The Inuit told stories that the searchers initially refused to believe. They spoke of white men walking south across the ice, dragging heavy sledges behind them. They described encounters with gaunt, desperate Europeans who gestured frantically but could not make themselves understood. Most disturbing of all, they told of finding camps where the evidence suggested that the civilized men had resorted to cannibalism in their final extremity. John Ray, a Hudson's Bay Company explorer who spoke Inuktitut fluently and understood Arctic survival, gathered these testimonies and presented them to the Admiralty in 1854. The British public reacted with horror and denial. The idea that their naval heroes had resorted to eating their own dead seemed to violate everything they believed about British character and Christian civilization. But the Inuit stories would eventually prove accurate in their horrible details. Modern archaeological evidence has confirmed that Franklin's men did indeed resort to cannibalism as starvation and desperation consumed them. Cut marks on bones found at campsites tell a story of men pushed beyond the boundaries of their own humanity by the inexorable demands of survival. Franklin himself likely died early in the disaster, possibly in 1847, sparing him the knowledge of what his expedition would become. The official record, discovered in a cairn on King William Island in 1859, told part of the story in terse naval language: both ships beset in ice, Franklin dead, the surviving 105 men attempting to reach the mainland on foot. But the full horror of their fate can only be imagined. Picture those men, products of the world's most powerful navy, trained in the disciplines of order and hierarchy, gradually stripped of everything that defined their civilization. The crystal goblets that had once held wine at officers' dinners became tools for melting ice. The silver cutlery that had graced their tables was abandoned on the ice as unnecessary weight. The books that had been meant to educate and entertain during long Arctic nights became fuel for desperate fires. They hauled sledges loaded with inexplicable items across the brutal landscape. Silk handkerchiefs, silver spoons, a desk complete with writing implements. These artifacts, discovered by later searchers, told a story of men who had lost the ability to distinguish between the essential and the ornamental, their minds clouded by lead poisoning from poorly soldered food tins, scurvy, and the psychological trauma of prolonged isolation. The Arctic had not simply killed Franklin's men. It had slowly stripped away their humanity, layer by layer, like ice wearing a waystone. In the end, they became something other than the civilized gentlemen who had sailed from England with such confidence and fanfare. The search for Franklin spawned a generation of Arctic explorers, each driven by the twin demons of duty and obsession. Captain Robert McClure, while searching for Franklin, became the first man to traverse the Northwest Passage, though he completed the journey on foot and in sledges rather than by ship. His ship, HMS Investigator, became trapped in the ice of Mercy Bay, and he and his crew abandoned her to walk across the frozen wasteland to rescue. The ship remained locked in ice for over a century, a perfectly preserved time capsule of Victorian era Arctic exploration. When modern archaeologists finally examined the site, they found personal items still arranged on tables, as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment, playing cards mid-game. Books opened to specific pages, pipes still, packed with tobacco. Elisha Kent Kane, the American explorer who led two expeditions in search of Franklin, wrote some of the most haunting descriptions of Arctic survival ever recorded. His men, trapped through to winters in northwestern Greenland, survived by learning from the local Inuit people, abandoning their civilized prejudices in favor of practical wisdom about survival in the cold. Kane described nights when the temperature dropped so low that their breath froze instantly, falling to the floor with a sound like rain. He wrote of the psychological effects of months of darkness, how men began to see things that weren't there, and hear voices calling to them from the ice. Some of his crew members developed what he called Arctic hysteria, a condition where grown men would suddenly burst into uncontrollable laughter or tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their isolation. The American Charles Francis Hall represents perhaps the most obsessed of all Franklin searchers. He spent nearly 2 decades in the Arctic, living among the Inuit and learning their survival techniques with a dedication that bordered on madness. He collected hundreds of Inuit testimonies about encounters with Franklin's men, slowly piecing together a narrative of the expedition's final months. Hall's own end was as mysterious as the fate he sought to uncover during his final expedition. To reach the North Pole, he became violently ill after drinking a cup of coffee, dying within days while raving about being poisoned. Modern analysis of his preserved remains has indeed found lethal levels of arsenic in his system, though whether he was murdered by his own men or fell victim to contaminated supplies remains an Arctic mystery. The Franklin searches revealed the true nature of Arctic exploration. It was not a gentleman's pursuit, but a savage contest between human will and the most unforgiving environment on Earth. The Arctic did not simply challenge explorers, it transformed them, stripping away the social conventions and moral certainties of civilization until only the raw human animal remained. Lady Jane Franklin herself became a figure of almost mythic proportions. Her refusal to accept her husband's death, driving her to fund expedition after expedition. She spent her fortune and her life in pursuit of answers, becoming known as the woman who made Arctic exploration a duty. Her relentless pressure on the British government helped launch dozens of search expeditions, mapping vast areas of the Arctic archipelago and advancing the cause of northern exploration by decades. But perhaps the most profound discovery of the Franklin era was not geographical, but psychological. The searches revealed that the Arctic was not simply an obstacle to be overcome by superior technology and British determination. It was a force that could reach into the human soul and reshape it completely. Men who entered the Arctic as officers and gentlemen emerged as something else entirely, if they emerged at all. The abandoned campsites discovered by search parties told stories that official reports could never capture. A silk handkerchief carefully folded beside the remains of a human skull, a silver fork clutched in skeletal fingers, a page torn from the Bible, marked with a passage about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. These artifacts spoke of men trying desperately to maintain their humanity, even as the Arctic methodically stripped it away. Charles Dickens, influenced by the Franklin searches, wrote in his journal about the dreary waste of the Arctic, describing it as a place where nature appears to have swept the whole surface clean with some tremendous broom, and then forgotten to put anything back. This image captured something essential about the Arctic's effect on the human imagination. It was not simply empty, but actively hostile to human presence, a place where civilization revealed its true fragility. The technological confidence of the early Victorian era slowly gave way to a more humble understanding of the Arctic's power. The steam engines and iron hulls that were supposed to conquer the ice proved inadequate against forces that operated on geological timescales. The careful planning and military discipline that had built the British Empire seemed almost comically irrelevant in a landscape where survival depended on reading the subtle signs of weather and ice conditions. Indigenous knowledge, long dismissed by European explorers as primitive superstition, began to be recognized as sophisticated science adapted to Arctic conditions. The Inuit understanding of ice types, weather patterns, and animal behavior represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom that could mean the difference between life and death in the far north. Dr. John Ray, one of the few European explorers who fully embraced Inuit survival techniques, became a controversial figure precisely because his success challenged European assumptions about racial and cultural superiority. His ability to travel vast distances across the Arctic using indigenous methods of transportation, shelter, and navigation demonstrated that the indigenous peoples of the North possessed knowledge and skills that European civilization could not match. Ray's reports about Franklin's fate, based on Inuit testimony, were initially rejected not because they were inaccurate, but because they challenged British concepts of heroism and national character. The idea that Royal Navy officers might resort to cannibalism violated Victorian sensibilities so profoundly that the truth was suppressed for decades. The psychological toll of Arctic exploration became a subject of medical study as more survivors returned with symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The profound isolation, the constant threat of death, and the complete dependence on other crew members created psychological pressures that few men could withstand without permanent damage to their mental health. Dr. Kane wrote extensively about what he called the Arctic mind, describing how prolonged exposure to the extreme environment created changes in perception and thinking that persisted long after returning to civilization. Survivors reported continuing to see ice fields in their dreams, to feel cold even in warm weather, and to experience panic attacks triggered by enclosed spaces after months of being trapped in small shelters. The family members of lost explorers faced their own particular form of psychological torment. Lady Jane Franklin's decades-long campaign to discover her husband's fate became a public spectacle that fascinated Victorian society. She represented both a devoted wife and the woman who refused to accept the traditional feminine role of passive mourning, instead becoming an active force in Arctic exploration. Her influence extended far beyond her personal quest. She understood that public interest in the Franklin mystery could be used to advance the broader cause of Arctic exploration and scientific knowledge. She cultivated relationships with newspaper editors, politicians, and members of the Royal Geographical Society, making Franklin's fate a matter of national honor that the British government could not ignore. The maps drawn by Franklin's searchers filled in vast blank spaces in the Arctic archipelago, revealing a landscape far more complex and extensive than anyone had imagined. What had been thought of as a simple waterway connecting the Atlantic and Pacific proved to be a maze of islands, channels, and shifting ice that defied easy navigation even with modern technology. Each expedition added pieces to the puzzle, but the complete picture that emerged was sobering rather than encouraging. The Northwest Passage existed, but it was not the commercial highway that promoters had envisioned. It was a marginal route through one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, usable only under ideal conditions by ships specifically designed for Arctic navigation. The economic dreams that had driven centuries of Arctic exploration proved to be mirages, as insubstantial as the fool's gold that had deluded Martin Frobisher. The real treasure of the Arctic lay not in gold or trade routes, but in the scientific knowledge gained through the sacrifice of so many lives. Understanding of meteorology, oceanography, magnetism, and natural history advanced dramatically through Arctic exploration, even as the human cost mounted year by year. The Franklin expedition became a watershed moment in the history of exploration, marking the end of the era when Europeans believed that superior technology and national character could overcome any natural obstacle. The Arctic had demonstrated that there were limits to human ambition, places where the natural world remained fundamentally unconquerable. Yet paradoxically, the failure of the Franklin expedition only intensified rather than discouraged Arctic exploration. Each new tragedy seemed to demand further investigation, creating a cycle of obsession that would continue for decades. The Arctic had become more than a geographical challenge. It had become a test of human character and national will that no amount of failure could diminish. The ships that sailed north in search of Franklin carried with them not just supplies and equipment, but the hopes and anxieties of an entire civilization grappling with the limits of its own power. In the ice-locked channels of the Arctic archipelago, Victorian confidence met its match in forces older and more powerful than human ambition. The silence that swallowed Franklin and his men became a silence that spoke to something fundamental about the relationship between humanity and the natural world. In that vast white emptiness, the certainties of civilization revealed themselves to be as fragile as ships' hulls pressed between shifting ice floes, subject to forces beyond human control or comprehension. And still, the ice waited, patient and eternal, ready to test the next generation of dreamers who would dare to challenge its ancient dominion over the top of the world. The hidden history of the Arctic was being written in ice and blood, a testament to both human courage and human hubris, recorded in the permanent silence of the polar night where failures and triumphs alike were preserved forever in the crystalline memory of the North. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a new kind of Arctic fever, one driven not merely by commerce or passage, but by the intoxicating allure of pure human achievement. The North Pole, that mathematical point at the Earth's crown, became the ultimate prize in what historians would later call the last great age of exploration. Yet beneath this noble pursuit lay darker currents, the stirrings of global powers, who would soon discover that the Arctic was not merely a frozen wasteland, but a strategic arena where the fate of nations might be decided. In the closing years of the 19th century, Fridtjof Nansen had demonstrated that reaching the North Pole was theoretically possible. His ship, the Fram, had drifted locked in ice for 3 years, proving that the polar ice cap moved in predictable patterns, but Nansen's attempt to reach the pole on foot had fallen short by mere degrees of latitude. The prize remained unclaimed, and ambitious men across the world sharpened their plans against the whetstone of polar ambition. The Norwegians' near success had revealed both the promise and the peril of polar exploration. His journals, read by firelight in drawing rooms across Europe and America, spoke of a landscape so alien it seemed to belong to another planet entirely. Here was ice that sang and groaned with its own alien music, aurora displays that painted the sky in colors for which no earthly language had adequate words, and temperatures that could freeze human breath before it fully left the lungs. Yet Nansen had also shown that with proper preparation, scientific methodology, and perhaps most importantly, the wisdom to work with the Arctic rather than against it, the impossible might become merely improbable. Into this atmosphere of fevered anticipation stepped two men whose rivalry would capture the world's imagination and forever change how humanity perceived the Arctic. Robert Edwin Peary, a career officer in the United States Navy's Civil Engineer Corps, and Frederick Albert Cook, a physician from New York whose genteel manner concealed an iron determination to stand where no human had stood before. Peary was a man shaped by the peculiar American confidence of his era, a belief that with sufficient determination and superior technology, any natural obstacle could be overcome. He had already made 8 previous attempts to reach the North Pole, each one teaching him hard lessons about the Arctic's capacity for both beauty and brutality. His method was systematic, almost military in its precision. He established a series of supply camps, used teams of Inuit hunters whose knowledge of ice travel was unparalleled, and employed specially designed sledges that could carry enormous loads across the shifting polar ice. Cook, by contrast, represented the romantic tradition of exploration. The notion that a single determined individual, lightly equipped and moving swiftly, could achieve what massive expeditions could not. He had served as surgeon on several Arctic expeditions and had developed his own theories about polar travel. Where Peary moved like a military campaign, Cook preferred to travel like a hunter, reading the ice, adapting to conditions, relying on intuition as much as instruments. The winter of 1908 found both men preparing for what they knew would be their final attempts. Peary, now in his early 50s, understood that his body could not endure many more Arctic campaigns. Cook, slightly younger but bearing the accumulated injuries of previous expeditions, felt the same urgency. Neither man knew that the other was planning a simultaneous assault on the pole, and this ignorance would later fuel one of the most bitter controversies in exploration history. Cook departed from the tiny settlement of Angakkuq in Greenland in February 1908, accompanied by 2 Inuit hunters, Awilla and Angakkuq. His plan was audaciously simple: travel light, move fast, and trust to skill and luck to see him through. Peary, meanwhile, was executing his elaborate system of supply relays, using multiple teams to ferry equipment northward while he conserved his energy for the final push. What happened during those months of 1908 and early 1909 remains, even today, shrouded in controversy and competing claims. Both men would later assert that they had reached the North Pole, Cook claiming to have arrived on April 21st, 1908, and Peary insisting he had achieved the goal on April 6, 1909. The evidence for both claims was problematic, consisting largely of photographs, journal entries, and the testimony of companions who were not equipped to verify precise navigational calculations. Cook returned to civilization first, emerging from the Arctic in September 1909 to global acclaim. Newspapers across the world trumpeted his achievement, and he was feted as a hero in European capitals. But Peary supporters, backed by powerful scientific and geographical societies, launched a systematic campaign to discredit Cook's claim. They questioned his navigational skills, pointed out inconsistencies in his account, and suggested that his photographs could have been taken anywhere in the Arctic. The controversy that erupted was more than a simple dispute between two explorers. It became a window into the changing nature of human achievement in the modern world. In previous centuries, exploration claims were often accepted on the word of gentlemen adventurers, but the 20th century demanded scientific proof, precise measurements, and corroborating evidence. The public, newly educated and skeptical, wanted more than stirring stories. They wanted facts. Modern analysis of both men's claims suggests that neither may have actually reached the mathematical North Pole. The techniques available to them for determining precise location were primitive by today's standards, and the constantly shifting nature of polar ice makes it nearly impossible to verify century-old position claims. But perhaps the literal truth of their achievement matters less than what their rivalry represented. The end of an era when individual heroism could capture global attention, and the beginning of a new age when Arctic exploration would become the domain of governments, military organizations, and international scientific collaborations. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 might have seemed irrelevant to the Arctic's frozen expanses, but the conflict fundamentally altered the region's strategic importance. For the first time in human history, the Arctic became not merely a destination for explorers and traders, but a theater of military operations where the balance of global power might tip. The war's impact on the Arctic was initially indirect, but profound. The traditional shipping routes through the Suez Canal and Mediterranean became increasingly dangerous as submarine warfare intensified. This drove Allied planners to consider alternative routes for moving supplies and resources. And suddenly, the Arctic passages that had obsessed explorers for centuries took on urgent military significance. The Murmansk Run, as it came to be known, became one of the war's most dangerous supply routes. Allied convoys, laden with weapons, food, and raw materials destined for the Russian front, had to navigate not only the Arctic's natural hazards, but also German U-boats that prowled beneath the ice like mechanical predators. The statistics were sobering. Nearly 1 in 4 ships that attempted the journey never reached their destination. For the sailors who plied these waters, the Arctic revealed new dimensions of terror. Beyond the ever-present threat of torpedo attack lay the prospect of death by exposure should their ship be sunk. The water was so cold that survival time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Ice fog could reduce visibility to mere yards, while storm systems generated waves that could crush even the largest vessels against ice floes. Yet the war also accelerated Arctic development in unexpected ways. The need for weather information to support military operations led to the establishment of the first permanent meteorological stations in the high Arctic. Radio communication, still in its infancy, was pushed to new limits as operators attempted to maintain contact across vast distances and through the ionospheric disturbances that plague Arctic communications. The Russian Revolution of 1917 added another layer of complexity to Arctic geopolitics. The Bolsheviks, struggling to consolidate power across the vast Russian territory, found themselves facing Allied intervention forces that landed at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. For a brief period, the Arctic became a battlefield where Russian Reds fought Russian Whites, while British, American, and Canadian forces attempted to prop up anti-Bolshevik governments. This intervention, though ultimately unsuccessful, established a pattern that would dominate Arctic geopolitics for the rest of the century. The region's strategic value lay not in its resources or inhabitants, but in its position as a potential avenue for projecting military power across the top of the world. Every major power began to realize that control of Arctic territories might prove crucial in future conflicts. The war's end brought a temporary lull in military interest in the Arctic, but the seeds of future conflict had been planted. Aviation technology, still primitive during the war, was advancing rapidly, and strategic thinkers were beginning to understand that aircraft flying over the North Pole could potentially deliver attacks across shorter distances than traditional routes. The Arctic was transforming from a mysterious frontier into a potential highway for destruction. The decades between the world wars marked a curious period in Arctic history, one where scientific curiosity and national ambition became increasingly intertwined. The age of individual polar heroes was ending, replaced by government-sponsored research expeditions that combined genuine scientific inquiry with barely concealed territorial ambitions. The Soviet Union emerged as the most aggressive Arctic power during this period. The communist government, eager to demonstrate the superiority of their planned economy, launched a series of spectacular Arctic achievements designed to capture global attention. The establishment of scientific stations on drifting ice floes, the first aerial expeditions to the North Pole, and the development of the Northern Sea route as a practical shipping channel all served dual purposes: advancing human knowledge while asserting Soviet dominance over the Arctic Ocean. The story of Ivan Paponin and his team exemplifies this period's blend of science and propaganda. In 1937, 4 Soviet scientists were landed at the North Pole aboard a specially equipped aircraft, establishing the first research station directly at the pole. For 274 days, they drifted on their ice floe, conducting meteorological and oceanographic observations while the world followed their progress through regular radio broadcasts. The scientific value of their work was genuine. They provided the first detailed observations of weather patterns at the pole and confirmed the existence of deep ocean basins beneath the Arctic ice. But the propaganda value was equally important to Soviet leaders. Here was proof that socialist planning and Soviet technology could achieve what individual capitalist adventurers could not. The successful rescue of Paponin's team, plucked from their disintegrating ice floe by Soviet icebreakers, became a symbol of technological triumph over natural forces. Meanwhile, other nations were developing their own Arctic capabilities, though often with less fanfare. The Canadian government, concerned about sovereignty over its vast Arctic archipelago, began establishing weather stations and Royal Canadian Mounted Police posts in remote locations. These outposts served multiple functions. They provided crucial meteorological data for aviation and shipping, asserted Canadian presence in disputed territories, and created a network of emergency facilities for aircraft attempting polar flights. The development of aviation during this period fundamentally altered Arctic geopolitics. Early Arctic flights were spectacular achievements that captured public imagination. Charles Lindbergh's survey flights over Greenland, the Graf Zeppelin's polar expedition, and numerous attempts to fly over the North Pole. But military planners were studying these flights with professional interest, understanding that aircraft capable of reaching the Arctic could potentially strike targets anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. The United States, somewhat belatedly, began to recognize the Arctic's strategic importance. Admiral Richard Byrd's polar flights and the establishment of American weather stations in Alaska and Greenland reflected growing awareness that the United States could not afford to ignore the northern approaches to the continent. The purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 had seemed like folly to many Americans. But by the 1930s, its strategic value was becoming apparent. Commercial aviation was also beginning to see the Arctic as a potential shortcut for intercontinental travel. Pan American Airways and other carriers began surveying polar routes that could cut days from travel time between North America and Europe or Asia. The technical challenges were enormous. Aircraft engines were unreliable in extreme cold. Navigation instruments could be affected by magnetic anomalies near the poles, and emergency landing sites were virtually non-existent. But the potential rewards were equally significant. This period also saw the first serious scientific study of Arctic climate and its relationship to global weather patterns. Researchers began to understand that the Arctic was not simply a frozen wasteland isolated from the rest of the world's climate system, but rather a crucial component that influenced weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. Changes in Arctic ice cover, they discovered, could affect rainfall in Europe, storm patterns over North America, and monsoon cycles in Asia. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic watched these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, the increasing scientific and governmental presence brought access to modern medicine, communication technologies, and economic opportunities. Weather stations needed local staff who understood ice conditions and survival techniques. Research expeditions required guides and hunters who could navigate safely across the ice. But this increased contact also brought cultural disruption and environmental concerns. Traditional hunting grounds were sometimes restricted for scientific or military purposes. Radio communications and aircraft flights disturbed wildlife migration patterns. Most significantly, the Arctic was beginning to lose its isolation from the political conflicts that periodically convulsed the rest of the world. The end of World War II might have brought peace to most of the world, but in the Arctic, it marked the beginning of the most intense period of militarization in the region's history. The Cold War transformed the Arctic from a scientific frontier into the world's most heavily monitored and weaponized frontier, where the slightest miscommunication could potentially trigger global nuclear conflict. The development of nuclear weapons fundamentally altered Arctic strategic calculations. The shortest route between the United States and Soviet Union passed directly over the North Pole, making the Arctic the most likely flight path for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both superpowers began constructing elaborate early warning systems across the Arctic, creating a network of radar stations, communication facilities, and military bases that stretched from Alaska to Norway. The distant early warning line, known as the Dew Line, became the most visible symbol of Cold War Arctic militarization. This chain of radar stations, constructed across northern Canada and Alaska in the 1950s, was designed to provide American and Canadian military commanders with advance warning of Soviet bomber attacks. The construction project was massive, requiring the transport of thousands of tons of equipment and supplies to some of the most remote locations on Earth. For the Inuit communities scattered across the Arctic, the Dew Line's construction brought profound changes. Traditional hunting and fishing grounds were disrupted by massive construction projects. Young Inuit men found employment as construction workers and equipment operators, earning cash wages that allowed them to purchase manufactured goods, but also began to erode traditional subsistence lifestyles. The psychological impact was equally significant. The Arctic, which had always represented isolation and refuge from the conflicts of the outside world, suddenly became ground zero for potential global destruction. Families who had lived for generations without seeing more than a dozen outsiders, in a year found themselves surrounded by military personnel, construction workers, and the constant drone of transport aircraft. Nuclear submarine warfare added another dimension to Arctic militarization. Both the United States and Soviet Union developed submarine fleets capable of operating beneath Arctic ice, creating an invisible war of cat and mouse that played out in the ocean depths. The USS Nautilus made the first submerged transit beneath the North Pole in 1958, demonstrating that nuclear submarines could use Arctic waters as a hidden highway for launching surprise attacks. The development of submarine-launched ballistic missiles made this threat even more acute. A nuclear submarine hiding beneath Arctic ice could potentially launch missiles at targets thousands of miles away, with virtually no warning time for defense systems. Both superpowers began developing increasingly sophisticated sonar networks to detect enemy submarines, turning the Arctic Ocean into an underwater battlefield where the stakes were measured in millions of potential casualties. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 demonstrated just how dangerous Arctic militarization had become. During the height of the crisis, a Soviet submarine carrying nuclear torpedoes surfaced near American destroyers in Arctic waters, and only the intervention of a single Soviet officer prevented the launch of a nuclear weapon that could have triggered World War III. Arctic bases were placed on high alert, and for several days, the region teetered on the edge of becoming the starting point for global nuclear war. Yet the Cold War also accelerated Arctic scientific research in unexpected ways. Both superpowers recognized that understanding Arctic weather patterns, ice dynamics, and ocean currents was crucial for military operations. This led to massive investments in Arctic research, producing advances in meteorology, oceanography, and glaciology that might have taken decades to achieve under peacetime conditions. The International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958 provided a brief respite from military tensions, allowing scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain to collaborate on Arctic research. Projects like the establishment of ice islands as research platforms and the first comprehensive mapping of Arctic ocean depths provided valuable scientific data while demonstrating that international cooperation in the Arctic was possible even during periods of intense political conflict. Environmental concerns began to emerge during this period as well, though they were often overshadowed by military priorities. The testing of nuclear weapons in Arctic environments, including several atmospheric tests in Alaska and the Soviet Union, raised questions about the long-term impact of radioactive contamination on Arctic ecosystems. The accumulation of industrial pollutants in Arctic food chains began to affect traditional subsistence, hunting, as traditional foods sometimes contained dangerous levels of heavy metals and other contaminants. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s brought a fundamental transformation to the Arctic, but not the peaceful return to scientific exploration that many had hoped for. Instead, the region found itself at the center of new kinds of competition: the race to understand and adapt to climate change, the scramble for newly accessible natural resources, and the emerging geopolitical tensions of a multipolar world, where traditional alliances were being challenged by rising powers. The first hint of these changes came from the scientists themselves. Researchers who had been monitoring Arctic ice conditions for decades began reporting alarming trends. Sea ice was retreating faster than anyone had predicted. Permafrost was thawing in areas where it had remained frozen for millennia, and weather patterns across the entire northern hemisphere were shifting in ways that suggested fundamental changes in Arctic climate systems. The implications of these changes extended far beyond the Arctic itself. As polar ice melted, global sea levels began to rise, threatening coastal communities from Bangladesh to Miami. The loss of Arctic sea ice, which had historically reflected solar radiation back into space, accelerated global warming through a feedback loop that climate scientists had predicted but hoped to avoid. Meanwhile, the thawing of permafrost began releasing vast quantities of methane and carbon dioxide that had been trapped in frozen soils for thousands of years. But climate change also brought unexpected opportunities. Shipping routes that had been impassable for most of human history began opening for longer periods each year. The Northwest Passage, that mythical shortcut that had obsessed explorers for centuries, became navigable by commercial vessels during summer months. The Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast began handling increasing volumes of cargo traffic, offering shipping companies a route between Europe and Asia that was thousands of miles shorter than traditional routes through the Suez Canal. The retreat of sea ice also revealed something that geologists had long suspected, but been unable to prove. The Arctic ocean floor contained vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals. Estimates suggested that the region might hold as much as 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves and 13% of its undiscovered oil. Nations with Arctic territories began reassessing the economic potential of their northern frontiers. Russia, with the longest Arctic coastline of any nation, moved aggressively to assert its claims over Arctic resources. In 2007, Russian submarines planted a titanium flag on the ocean floor directly beneath the North Pole, a symbolic gesture that was widely interpreted as a claim to the entire Arctic Ocean. Russian military exercises in Arctic waters became increasingly frequent and sophisticated, demonstrating capabilities that had been allowed to decay during the chaotic 1990s. The United States found itself playing catch-up in Arctic affairs. Despite Alaska's strategic location, American Arctic policy had been largely reactive rather than proactive. The Obama administration began developing a more comprehensive Arctic strategy, but the country's icebreaker fleet remained inadequate for sustained Arctic operations, and military infrastructure in Alaska had been scaled back after the Cold War. Canada faced particular challenges in asserting Arctic sovereignty. The country's claims to the Northwest Passage, as internal waters were disputed by the United States and other maritime nations, who insisted that the passage should be considered international waters open to all shipping. The Harper government invested heavily in Arctic infrastructure and military capabilities, but the vast distances and harsh conditions made effective surveillance and control difficult. New players entered the Arctic game as well. China, despite having no Arctic territory, declared itself a near-Arctic state and began investing heavily in Arctic research and infrastructure. Chinese companies purchased stakes in Arctic mining operations. Chinese research vessels began regular Arctic expeditions, and Chinese investors funded infrastructure projects across the Arctic region. This growing Chinese presence alarmed traditional Arctic powers, who worried about the strategic implications of Chinese involvement in Arctic affairs. The European Union developed its own Arctic strategy, focusing on environmental protection and sustainable development. Nordic countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark through Greenland found themselves balancing economic opportunities against environmental concerns and traditional relationships with indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples who had survived millennia of Arctic environmental challenges found themselves on the front lines of rapid climate change. Traditional knowledge about ice conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior knowledge that had been passed down through generations was becoming less reliable as environmental conditions changed faster than human memory could accommodate. Hunting and fishing patterns that had sustained Arctic communities for centuries were disrupted as species ranges shifted northward. Ice conditions became unpredictable, and traditional food sources became contaminated with industrial pollutants carried north by ocean and atmospheric currents. Many communities found themselves caught between the desire to preserve traditional lifestyles and the need to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Yet indigenous communities also became important players in Arctic governance. International bodies, like the Arctic Council, began including indigenous representatives as permanent observers, recognizing that traditional knowledge could provide crucial insights into environmental changes that scientific instruments might miss. Indigenous hunting guides became essential partners for researchers studying climate change impacts, while traditional knowledge systems provided historical context for understanding the speed and scale of current environmental changes as the 21st century entered its third decade. The Arctic had become a bellwether for humanity's relationship with the natural world, and a testing ground for international cooperation in an era of increasing global tension. The region that had once represented the ultimate frontier, remote, pristine, and largely untouched by human activity, now found itself at the center of debates about climate change, resource extraction, territorial sovereignty, and the future of international law. The pace of environmental change in the Arctic accelerated beyond what even the most pessimistic climate models had predicted. Summer sea ice extent, which had historically varied within relatively narrow bounds, began experiencing dramatic year-to-year fluctuations. Some summers saw ice coverage drop to levels not seen for tens of thousands of years, while other years brought unexpected recovery that gave false hope to those who questioned the reality of long-term climate trends. The Greenland ice sheet, containing enough water to raise global sea levels by over 20 feet if completely melted, became a focal point for climate research and international concern. Satellite measurements revealed that the ice sheet was losing mass at accelerating rates, with meltwater flowing into the ocean in quantities that dwarfed historical averages. Yet the complexity of ice sheet dynamics meant that predictions about Future melting rates remained uncertain, hampering efforts to plan for sea level rise in coastal communities around the world. Arctic permafrost, that vast reservoir of frozen organic matter that underlies much of the northern landscape, began thawing in ways that surprised even researchers who specialized in Arctic soils. Infrastructure built on permafrost roads, buildings, pipelines. Airports began experiencing structural failures as the ground beneath them softened and shifted. Communities that had existed for generations in the same locations found themselves facing relocation as riverbanks eroded and coastal areas were inundated by rising seas. The economic implications of these environmental changes created new tensions between nations with Arctic territories and the international community. As shipping routes opened and resource extraction became more feasible, questions arose about who had the right to benefit from Arctic development and who should bear the costs of environmental protection. The Arctic Council, established in 1996 as a forum for cooperation among Arctic nations, found itself struggling to balance economic interests against environmental concerns. The organization's consensus-based decision-making process, which had worked well when Arctic issues were primarily scientific and environmental, became increasingly strained as economic and security concerns grew more prominent. Military activities in the Arctic, which had decreased after the Cold War's end, began increasing again as nations sought to protect their territorial claims and secure access to resources. Russia resumed regular bomber patrols over Arctic waters and established new military bases on Arctic islands. The United States strengthened its presence in Alaska and began joint exercises with Arctic allies. Even non-Arctic nations began developing Arctic military capabilities, recognizing that future conflicts might extend into the polar regions. Yet the Arctic also demonstrated humanity's capacity for cooperation in the face of shared challenges. International research collaborations produced unprecedented insights into Arctic systems and their connections to global climate. The International Polar Year projects brought together scientists from dozens of nations to study Arctic and Antarctic environments, creating databases and research networks that transcended political boundaries. Search and rescue cooperation in the Arctic became a model for international collaboration. The region's harsh conditions and vast distances meant that no single nation could effectively respond to emergencies across the entire Arctic. The Arctic Council's agreement on cooperation on aeronautical and maritime search and rescue in the Arctic created a framework for coordinated response that prioritized human life over territorial disputes. Tourism in the Arctic presented both opportunities and challenges for the region's future. Cruise ships began regular voyages through previously inaccessible waters, bringing thousands of visitors to remote Arctic communities and pristine wilderness areas. This tourism provided economic opportunities for indigenous communities and remote settlements, but also raised concerns about environmental impact and cultural preservation. The relationship between Arctic development and indigenous rights became increasingly complex as economic opportunities multiplied. Traditional subsistence activities remained crucial for cultural identity and food security in many Arctic communities, but they were increasingly affected by industrial development, climate change, and regulatory restrictions. Some communities embraced new economic opportunities, while others sought to maintain traditional lifestyles. Despite changing conditions, scientific research in the Arctic evolved to address not just environmental questions, but also social and economic challenges facing Arctic communities. Researchers began collaborating more closely with indigenous knowledge holders, recognizing that traditional observations and understanding could provide insights unavailable through conventional scientific methods. This collaboration produced new approaches to environmental monitoring and community-based research that respected both scientific rigor and traditional knowledge systems. The Arctic's role in global communications became increasingly important as submarine cables and satellite networks expanded to serve Arctic communities and support resource extraction activities. The region's geographic position made it a crucial link in global communications networks, but its harsh environment and sparse population made infrastructure development particularly challenging and expensive. As the Arctic entered the 2020s, it had become clear that the region's future would be shaped not just by environmental forces, but by human decisions about resource use, territorial claims, and international cooperation. The choices made by Arctic nations, indigenous communities, and the international community would determine whether the Arctic remained a laboratory for peaceful cooperation or became another arena for global competition and conflict. The story of the Arctic in the modern era reflects broader themes of human adaptation, environmental change, and the challenges of governing common resources in an interconnected world. The region that had once seemed infinitely remote and unchanging had become a barometer for humanity's impact on the Earth and a testing ground for our capacity to work together in addressing global challenges. In research stations scattered across the Arctic, scientists continued their patient work of observation and analysis, adding daily measurements to datasets that stretched back decades or centuries. Their work provided the foundation for understanding Arctic systems and predicting future changes, but also revealed the enormous complexity and interconnectedness of Arctic environments with global systems. The Arctic's indigenous peoples, who had witnessed more environmental change in their lifetimes than their ancestors had experienced over many generations, continued adapting their traditional practices to new conditions while working to preserve cultural knowledge and practices that might be lost forever if not carefully maintained and transmitted to younger generations. International bodies and national governments continued wrestling with questions about Arctic governance that had no clear precedents in international law. The region's unique characteristics, its harsh environment, sparse population, complex territorial claims, and global significance, traditional approaches to sovereignty, resource management, and environmental protection. As this chapter of Arctic history drew toward its conclusion, one thing had become certain: the Arctic would never again be the remote, unchanging frontier that had captured the imagination of earlier generations. It had become, instead, a region where global forces converged, where environmental change proceeded at unprecedented rates, and where decisions made in boardrooms in capitals thousands of miles away had immediate and profound impacts on the ice, the wildlife, and the people who called the Arctic home. The hidden history of the Arctic was no longer hidden, it had become part of humanity's shared story, a reminder both of our capacity to explore and understand the natural world and of our responsibility to protect it for future generations. The research station hummed with quiet efficiency, its computers processing data streams that would have been incomprehensible to the explorers who first dared to venture into these frozen realms. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her gloved hand against the reinforced window, watching the midnight sun paint the ice fields in shades of gold and amber that seemed to pulse with ancient memory. The year was 2023, and the Arctic she studied bore little resemblance to the wilderness that had claimed so. Many lives in centuries past, the ice beneath her feet told stories that stretched back millions of years. But now those stories were changing, with unprecedented speed. Where once the permafrost had remained locked in eternal slumber, now it stirred and shifted, releasing methane plumes that rose like ghostly fingers toward the atmosphere. The ancient carbon, locked away since the time of mammoths, found its voice again in a world that had forgotten how to listen to such whispers. In the research camps scattered across the Arctic, scientists worked with the focused intensity of those who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history. The data streams flowing from satellites and weather stations painted a picture that would have seemed like science fiction to the explorers of earlier centuries. The Arctic was warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet, a phenomenon that scientists had termed Arctic amplification, though the technical name could not capture the profound implications of what was unfolding. The sea ice that had once formed an impenetrable barrier, turning back the greatest naval expeditions in history, now retreated each summer to record lows. Ships that once would have been crushed in the ice now sailed freely through passages that Franklin and his men had died trying to find. The Northwest Passage, that mythical route that had consumed so much effort and so many lives, had become a seasonal shipping lane, its waters dark and open under the perpetual Arctic sun. Ingakkuq, one of the northernmost settlements in the world, elderly Inuit hunters shared their observations with visiting researchers. They spoke of changes that their grandfathers had never seen: rain falling on the ice in winter, seals surfacing in places where the ice had always been solid, polar bears ranging further inland as their traditional hunting grounds disappeared. The knowledge passed down through generations, encoded in stories and seasonal observations, now seemed to be unraveling as the very foundation of Arctic life shifted beneath their feet. Angakkuq, whose name meant young ice in a new, guided scientists across landscapes that his ancestors had known intimately for thousands of years. At 67, he had witnessed changes that troubled him in ways he struggled to articulate in either his native language or in English. The ice roads that once connected communities through the dark months now formed later and melted earlier. The patterns of wind and weather that had guided his people through countless seasons seemed to be following new rules that no elder could remember. The ice speaks differently now, he told the researchers, his weathered hands gesturing toward the horizon where icebergs floated in water that should have been solid. It tells stories our grandfathers never heard. His words carried the weight of cultural knowledge accumulated over millennia. Knowledge that was suddenly confronting changes beyond its accumulated wisdom. As the ice retreated, it revealed treasures that dwarfed the gold rushes of the past. Beneath the Arctic Ocean lay an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil reserves and 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. The same fossil fuels that were warming the planet now beckoned from beneath the melting ice, creating a paradox that policymakers and environmentalists grappled with in conference rooms, thousands of miles from the ice fields themselves. Russian icebreakers pushed deeper into the Arctic Ocean than ever before, their nuclear reactors providing the power to break through ice that would have stopped conventional vessels. Chinese cargo ships began regular transits through the Northern Sea route, cutting weeks off the journey between Asia and Europe. The geopolitical map of the Arctic, once defined by the harsh realities of ice and isolation, was being redrawn by the economics of accessibility. In the offices of shipping companies in Copenhagen and Hamburg, executives studied new route maps with the same intensity that medieval merchants had once examined caravan routes across the Silk Road. The Arctic was becoming a new frontier of global commerce, its waters transformed from barrier to highway in the span of a few decades. Insurance companies calculated new risk assessments for Arctic shipping, while naval strategists in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing contemplated the military implications of an increasingly navigable north. The town of Hammerfest, Norway, once a remote fishing village, found itself at the center of a new energy boom as liquefied natural gas facilities rose like industrial cathedrals against the Arctic landscape. The facility's lights glowed 24 hours a day during the polar night, processing gas extracted from beneath the Barents Sea. Local residents, whose families had lived by fishing and reindeer herding for generations, now found themselves hosting engineers and technicians from around the world, their traditional lifestyle intersecting with global energy markets in ways that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents. The Sami people, whose reindeer herds had migrated across the Arctic tundra for thousands of years, found their ancient roots disrupted by new infrastructure. The animals, guided by instincts honed over millennia, hesitated at pipeline crossings and industrial complexes that had appeared seemingly overnight in landscapes that had remained unchanged for generations. Traditional knowledge keepers worked with biologists to understand how the warming climate was affecting migration patterns, but the changes were happening faster than either traditional wisdom or scientific study could fully comprehend. Despite the profound changes reshaping their homeland, indigenous communities across the Arctic demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. In Alaska, Inupiaq communities combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern technology, using drones to monitor sea ice conditions while still relying on elder wisdom to interpret the subtle signs of changing weather patterns. Young hunters learned to read satellite imagery alongside the traditional skills of reading ice and weather that their ancestors had developed over countless generations. The village of Angakkuq, formerly known as Barrow, had become an unlikely center of climate research. Its location at the northernmost tip of Alaska, making it a crucial observation point for understanding Arctic change. The community's traditional whaling captains worked alongside scientists, sharing knowledge about ice conditions and wildlife behavior that proved invaluable to researchers trying to understand the complex dynamics of a rapidly changing ecosystem. Mary Sage Omiak, a traditional food preservation expert, had begun documenting changes in the plants and animals that her people had relied upon for sustenance for thousands of years. She noted that berries were ripening at different times, affecting not just human food gathering, but also the feeding patterns of migratory birds and marine mammals. Her careful observations, recorded in both Inupiaq and English, provided data that complemented scientific monitoring with insights that could only come from intimate, long-term relationship with the land across the Arctic. Indigenous languages encoded knowledge about ice conditions, weather patterns, and animal behavior that had no equivalent in scientific terminology. Words like Sekuliak in Angakkuq, describing young ice that was safe to walk on, or Pukak referring to the sugar snow that provided insulation for animals and plants, represented thousands of years of accumulated observation and understanding. As the climate changed, these linguistic treasures took on new importance as repositories of knowledge about Arctic systems that were now transforming before everyone's eyes in Greenland. Elderly hunters spoke of changes in sea ice formation that their language could describe with precision that surprised visiting scientists. The Inuit taxonomy of ice types included dozens of terms for different conditions, each one representing not just a description, but a survival strategy developed over generations of Arctic living. As researchers struggled to develop new models for understanding Arctic change, they increasingly turned to indigenous knowledge holders whose ancestors had been observing and adapting to Arctic conditions for millennia. The changes unfolding in the Arctic reverberated far beyond the polar regions, affecting weather patterns and sea levels across the globe. The jet stream, that river of air that separates Arctic cold from temperate warmth, began to meander in unprecedented ways as the temperature difference between the poles and the equator diminished. Scientists in meteorological centers from London to Tokyo watched computer models that showed Arctic warming influencing everything from monsoon patterns in Asia to hurricane formation in the Atlantic. In coastal cities around the world, engineers and urban planners studied projections of sea level rise that included calculations of Arctic ice loss. The Greenland ice sheet, containing enough water to raise global sea levels by 20 feet if completely melted, became a focus of intense scientific attention. researchers established camps on the ice sheet, where they drilled deep cores that revealed the history of Earth's climate stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, seeking clues about how quickly ice sheets could respond to warming. The permafrost, that permanently frozen ground that underlay much of the Arctic, began to thaw in ways that released stored carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Scientists calculated that the permafrost contained more carbon than all the world's forests combined, locked away in frozen organic matter accumulated over tens of thousands of years. As this ancient carbon entered the atmosphere, it accelerated the very warming that was causing the thaw, creating a feedback loop that concerned climate researchers around the world. In research stations across the Arctic, teams of international scientists worked together with an urgency that reflected their understanding of the global implications of Arctic change. The data they collected was transmitted via satellite to climate modeling centers, where supercomputers processed the information to create projections of future conditions. These models suggested that the Arctic was approaching tipping points beyond which changes might become irreversible, transforming not just the polar regions but the entire Earth system. The Arctic Council, established in 1996 as a forum for cooperation among Arctic nations, found its meetings increasingly focused on adaptation and mitigation strategies rather than simple conservation. Representatives from 8 Arctic nations, along with indigenous organizations holding permanent participant status, grappled with questions that had no precedent in international law or diplomacy. How should sovereignty be maintained over territories that were literally disappearing under rising seas? How could traditional ways of life be preserved when the environmental foundations of those traditions were shifting? As the Arctic transformed, technology became both a tool for understanding change and a means of adaptation for communities facing unprecedented challenges. Satellite monitoring systems provided real-time data on ice conditions that hunters and fishermen could access through smartphone apps, combining space-age technology with traditional knowledge in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. GPS systems guided travelers across landscapes where traditional landmarks were disappearing, while social media connected Arctic communities separated by vast distances of ice and tundra. On Svalbard, the global seed vault, often called the Doomsday Vault, housed seeds from around the world in chambers carved deep into the permafrost. The facility, designed to preserve agricultural biodiversity for future generations, found itself dealing with unexpected challenges as warming temperatures caused water infiltration into areas that had been assumed to remain permanently frozen. The irony was not lost on scientists that a facility designed to protect against global catastrophe was itself being affected by climate change. Arctic communities began to innovate in ways that combined traditional knowledge with modern technology. In Alaska, native corporations invested in renewable energy projects that reduced their dependence on fossil fuels, while providing economic development for rural communities. Wind farms rose from the tundra, their turbines turning in the constant Arctic winds, while solar panel installations took advantage of the continuous daylight of Arctic summers. The University of the Arctic, a cooperative network of universities and colleges from across the circumpolar north, developed new programs that integrated indigenous knowledge with Western science. Students learned to read both computer climate models and traditional environmental indicators, preparing for careers that would require understanding both technological tools and ancestral wisdom. These educational programs represented a new approach to Arctic research that recognized the value of multiple ways of knowing. Research stations themselves began to adapt to changing conditions, with buildings designed to adjust to shifting permafrost, and ice platforms that could accommodate changing sea ice conditions. The architecture of Arctic research evolved from the permanent structures of earlier eras to flexible, adaptable facilities that could respond to an environment in rapid transition. Scientists learned to work with infrastructure that might shift or move as the foundation of ice and permafrost changed beneath their feet. Looking toward the future, scientists and policymakers grappled with projections that suggested the Arctic of the late 21st century would be fundamentally different from the Arctic that had existed throughout human history. Computer models suggested scenarios ranging from ice-free Arctic summers within decades to more gradual changes that might unfold over centuries. The uncertainty itself became a challenge for communities and nations trying to plan for an unknowable future. Young people and Arctic communities found themselves inheriting a world that would require new forms of adaptation and resilience. In schools across the circumpolar north, children learned traditional skills alongside climate science, preparing for lives that would need to bridge ancient knowledge and future challenges. They studied the stories of their ancestors, while also learning to use tools that would help them navigate a changing environment. The concept of Arctic stewardship evolved to encompass not just conservation of existing conditions, but active management of change. Restoration projects aimed at rebuilding sea ice or preserving permafrost competed for funding and attention with adaptation. Projects designed to help communities thrive in a transformed Arctic. The question was no longer simply how to preserve the Arctic, but how to guide its transformation in ways that maintained both ecological integrity and cultural continuity. International cooperation in the Arctic took on new dimensions as nations recognized that Arctic change affected global systems that respected no political boundaries. The Arctic became a laboratory for new forms of diplomacy and cooperation, with scientific collaboration often leading where political agreements struggled to follow. Research partnerships crossed national boundaries with an ease that reflected the shared understanding that Arctic change was a global challenge requiring global solutions. Indigenous communities, whose ancestors had survived ice ages and warm periods long before written history, approached the future with a perspective shaped by deep time and adaptive experience. Traditional stories spoke of previous periods of environmental change and the strategies that had allowed communities to survive and thrive through transitions. These narratives, passed down through generations, provided frameworks for understanding change that complemented scientific projections with wisdom, accumulated over millennia. As the Arctic entered an era of unprecedented change, the lessons of its long history took on new relevance. The same forces that had shaped human societies in the Arctic for thousands of years, adaptation, cooperation, and resilience in the face of extreme conditions, would be crucial for navigating the challenges ahead. The Arctic had always been a place where survival depended on careful observation, precise knowledge, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. The explorers who had risked everything to chart Arctic waters had demonstrated the power of human determination and curiosity, even when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. Their successors in the 21st century, scientists, indigenous knowledge holders, policymakers, and community leaders, drew inspiration from that legacy of perseverance while applying it to challenges that the early explorers could never have imagined. The Arctic had taught countless lessons about the interconnectedness of global systems. Long before climate science had the tools to measure and model those connections, indigenous knowledge had always recognized that changes in ice conditions could affect weather patterns far to the south, that the timing of animal migrations could influence plant communities, and that human actions had consequences that rippled through complex environmental systems. The research stations and monitoring networks that now dotted the Arctic landscape represented humanity's attempt to understand and respond to planetary-scale changes. The data they collected would inform decisions made in capitals and corporate headquarters around the world, carrying the voice of the Arctic into global conversations about energy, transportation, conservation, and adaptation. Traditional ecological knowledge and Western science were finding new ways to collaborate and complement each other in understanding Arctic change. The patient observation skills that had allowed indigenous communities to thrive in extreme environments for thousands of years provided crucial insights for researchers trying to understand complex environmental systems. This collaboration represented a new model for how human societies might approach environmental challenges, drawing on the full range of human knowledge and experience. The sun never truly set on the Arctic summer of 2023, painting the ice fields in colors that shifted from gold to silver to deep blue as it traced its circular path around the sky. In research stations and indigenous communities, on icebreakers, and in university laboratories, people worked to understand and adapt to changes that were reshaping one of Earth's last wilderness frontiers. The Arctic had always been a place of extremes. Extreme cold, extreme isolation, extreme beauty, an extreme challenge. Now it was experiencing extreme change, serving as both a warning and a laboratory for understanding how human societies could respond to environmental transformation. The same qualities that had made the Arctic a place of legend and mystery, its vastness, its power to humble human ambition, its ability to inspire both terror and wonder, now made it a crucial theater for humanity's efforts to understand and shape its relationship with the planet. In the end, the hidden history of the Arctic was not truly hidden at all. but written in ice and stone, in traditional stories and scientific data, in the experiences of all those who had ventured into the far north and returned changed by the encounter. It was a history that continued to unfold with each passing season, each new discovery, each adaptation to changing conditions. The Arctic remained what it had always been, a teacher, a challenge, and a reminder of both human limitations and human potential. As night fell over the research stations scattered across the Arctic landscape, though night in the polar, summer was more a deepening of colors than true darkness. The work continued. Satellites transmitted data, computers processed models, and human observers recorded the subtle changes that instruments might miss. The Arctic continued its ancient dialogue with the rest of the planet, though now that conversation included new voices and new urgencies. The story of the Arctic was far from over. Each day brought new data, new insights, and new challenges. Children born in Arctic communities would grow up in a world their grandparents could barely imagine, but they would carry forward the same qualities that had allowed human societies to thrive in the Arctic for thousands of years: adaptability, resilience, and the wisdom to learn from both success and failure. The hidden history of the Arctic, revealed through ice cores and archaeological sites, through traditional stories and satellite images, spoke to fundamental questions about human society and environmental change. It was a history that offered both warnings and hope, reminding readers that humans had faced periods of dramatic environmental change before, and had found ways to adapt and survive. Perhaps most importantly, the Arctic continued to inspire the same sense of wonder and respect that had motivated explorers and researchers for centuries. In a world increasingly shaped by human activity, the Arctic remained a place where natural forces still commanded respect and humility. It was a laboratory for understanding global systems, a homeland for resilient communities, and a reminder that the planet's story was still being written. The lights of the research stations twinkled like stars scattered across the endless expanse of ice and tundra, each one representing human curiosity and determination in the face of one of Earth's most challenging environments. As the Arctic entered an uncertain future, those lights served as beacons of hope that human ingenuity and cooperation could rise to meet the challenges ahead. The last entry in the research log that night noted the temperature, wind speed, and ice conditions, continuing a tradition of careful observation that stretched back through centuries of Arctic exploration. The numbers would be transmitted to databases around the world, becoming part of the vast accumulation of knowledge that humanity was building about its changing planet. And in the morning, the work would continue, carrying forward the legacy of all those who had ventured north in search of knowledge, adventure, and understanding. The Arctic would continue to teach its lessons to anyone patient enough to listen, humble enough to learn, and brave enough to face the challenges of an uncertain but always fascinating future. Thank you for this journey through Arctic history. Traveled through thousands of years of Arctic history, from ancient ice formation to contemporary climate challenges. If this 3-hour journey through the hidden history of the Arctic has enriched your understanding and helped you drift into peaceful sleep, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to fall asleep to history. Your support helps us create more immersive historical journeys for sleepy minds around the world. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Drop a comment and let us know. We read every single message and love connecting with our global community of history lovers. Sweet dreams, and thank you for exploring the Arctic with us. Until our next historical journey together, may your rest be as peaceful as the eternal Arctic night.